So just to start, I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about yourself and the work that you do.
Great, yeah, and thanks so much for having me. So my name's Katie Reid. I'm based here in Edinburgh in Scotland in the UK. And yeah, I work within the field of children's human rights. I'm currently working with the Children's Parliament, an organisation that was found 25 years ago here in Scotland. And I've been working there for 3 years on a number of different projects and programmes, which, yeah, are essentially about ensuring that children across Scotland's views and ideas are shaping and informing decision-making processes happening across here in Scotland, as well as things like community development processes and academic research as well. Service delivery provision. It's really about putting children's rights and participation at the heart of what we do. I've kind of involved with a few different other pieces as well. This year was involved with the Observatory for Children's Human Rights here in Scotland. We were commissioned by the Children and Young People's Commissioner here in Scotland to undertake a rapid child rights impact assessment, which was independent to those being undertaken by the Scottish Government, to look at all of the measures introduced by the Scottish Government around COVID-19 and the impact that these measures were having on children and their rights across Scotland. And so that's also been a kind of key piece of work that I've been involved with this year. And right now we're working together as the team that produced that CREA. We're working together to create a special journal edition, kind of capturing some of those findings
Wow.
from that process. So that's something that we're moving into in the new year, which is really exciting.
Wow, that's amazing. So it's your journal is all from young people themselves.
So this journal will be a combination of working with experts in the different subject areas that contributed to that CREA. And the CREA itself was informed by children and young people's views as best as possible. Of course, this was undertaken in April and May when COVID and the impact of the pandemic was still very new. And so the evidence that was available for us to draw on in our individual components of the CREA, which was kind of underpinned by the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, so the UNCRC. It meant that as far as possible, we were working with a whole host of kind of service providers, community groups, schools, to make sure that we could get as much evidence about how it was impacting children as possible. So the CREA itself, yes, had children's participation. It's kind of woven through it. But the journal itself, there will be contributions from young people, which is really exciting and quite a big task, writing an academic paper. So yeah, it will be there, but there'll be also experts from across the sector in Scotland contributing as well.
Amazing, thank you.
That sounds great. I mean, one other question too is maybe you can just explain a little bit more on what a child rights impact assessment is, just for those who may not know what it is, just really briefly, if you don't mind.
Yeah, no problem at all. So a child rights impact assessment is a framework in which, well, anyone can use it, but often duty bearers are those who are making decisions that will impact on children and young people's lives and implicitly their human rights, will take, and it's essentially like a kind of, without saying a checkbox, it is a little bit of an exercise for them to reflect on how the decisions that they are making may impact on a child's life, and both positively and or negatively. And it's about then using that as an opportunity to mitigate against potential negative impacts on their rights. And so this is kind of a key part of the duties that those who are making the decisions have to do. The extent to which they are done in a way which is, yes, safeguarding children's rights is, it varies across the world. And here in Scotland, we're looking at trying to make it a more robust and more kind of sustainable and more routine procedure that duty bearers and decision makers are doing as we look to further realise children's human rights here in Scotland and fully implement them here in both legislation, policy and practice.
That's great. That's perfect. Thanks so much, Katie. Okay, so I think, with all of that kind of background information, and now that we know kind of all the work that you're doing, I want to start and, just kind of highlight that really the focus of today's discussion is on children's rights and child participation, a really important area and an area that you're obviously very familiar with. So, this is kind of a first, this question is a little bit broad, but in your perspective, if you don't mind telling us, how do you define child participation? What does that really mean? And especially, in the context of the work that you do with young people.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, and I think it's important to just say that participation is a really loaded term, and it can sometimes take seemingly, infinite forms and definitions. And I guess there's kind of lots of different ways to look at it. And I mean, broadly speaking, the sort of formal concept of children's participation, perhaps as we know it in tandem with, for example, the UNCRC or child's participation rights, this kind of has been used quite widely and variably to describe kind of children's involvement in decision-making processes. And that can be right from the home and school and community up to national and international processes. It can also be their involvement and contribution towards like social justice movements and campaigns, research, and children and youth parliaments, advisory groups, and councils. So this is kind of this formalized understanding of children's participation. But I guess it's also important, or at least when I'm thinking of it, to remember that actually children's participation, it can sometimes decide this particularly like defined concept can sometimes risk glossing over the fact that participation has long been shown to be a kind of common and formal feature of childhood as well. And I guess my kind of journey into this field was through my interest in social anthropology, and I think studying the kind of cross-cultural different experiences of childhood and what that means it really highlights and shows how participation is actually really intrinsically linked to how we play, how we work, how we learn, and actually that participating in kind of familial or community activities is like often a process by which like children kind of learn about social norms and cultural expectations and can acquire and develop new skills and knowledge and competencies through their relationships with other children or even other adults or other people within their community. So I think it's important to highlight that children's participation, there is this kind of formalized kind of collective understanding that we are often using within maybe the children's rights sector, but that actually participation can also just mean about children's involvement and experiential learning, if you like, through being part of a familial group or community and taking part in different activities. So it's a complicated term, but I think in this context, when we're thinking about children's rights, we are often referring to this idea of it being that kind of collective experience where children can exercise their right to have a say and be taken seriously.
Perfect. That's really great. So my next question actually sort of builds on what you were saying. So we know that there's often a tension between tokenistic participation and meaningful participation. So in your view and based on your experience, what makes participation meaningful for young people?
Yeah, so I work with children, and it's actually quite interesting. And I'll just maybe say, like, when using like young people, I often will say children, just because the definition of a child as under the UNCRC is those up to the age of 18. So, and I know that from working with children, young people doesn't always resonate with what they would use necessarily to define themselves. So when I'm saying children, it's more just because that's kind of, I've kind of got it instilled into me now, but I am referring to children up to the age of 18. So to me, what makes participation authentic and meaningful is a few things. At the heart of meaningful participation, it's really about relationships. And I think it's about ensuring that, that ample time and I guess it's about making sure that time is given to develop those relationships in order for it to be a really relational and dialogical process. I think that it's really that kind of the tokenistic element that people often refer to is about, I can think, that sense of like parachuting in, like adults often parachuting in and asking questions that they already have an idea of what those answers are going, they want, what answers they want to hear, and less about the child or children leading the discussion, or helping to create an equal playing field where it's a conversation between children and adults rather than children responding to ideals or kind of expectations that adults have already kind of set. So yeah, I do think it's interesting as well to think about what the outcome or the intended outcome of the participation is. And obviously there's both an individual outcome within participation for that individual child who's involved, as well as there often being the collective outcome as well. So what is this trying to achieve for more children or all children by going through this process? And I think it's really interesting to think about what children themselves say about what makes participation really meaningful and authentic. And from kind of my own work, but also drawing on like the research that's been done by lots of academics who've done children's participation work, I think it's really interesting to see some of the common things that children do share about what they get out of being involved in these kind of these processes. And I think, well, first of all, enjoyment. So making sure that the experience is one that is, yeah, it's going to allow a child to have an enjoyable, fun, and meaningful full time. I think also children often talk about it being an opportunity to develop skills themselves. So it's a way for them to feel like they're gaining something from the process, and not, yeah, it's a mutually beneficial process for all involved. Increased confidence, as well as an opportunity to build relationships and friendships with other children, but also with adults. And I think that on the part of the adult is a really important thing to be remembering, that these spaces are for for relationships to develop. And that can, yeah, of course, be between the children and adult. But if there's lots of children involved, then I think it's a really important message that we need to be dedicating time for them to develop relationships with one another as well, and being able to develop skills such as empathy and trust and respect for one another's experiences is such an important part of any participatory experience. And I guess also making sure that we're constantly reflecting on our own attitudes and our own biases as an adult. And I think there's been some really helpful work and research done around how that we can ensure that our position and our kind of responsibility as adults, we're reflecting on that at all times, so that we're ensuring that really we're a facilitator for children to come up with or produce knowledge in and amongst themselves, rather than coming in and assuming that we have all the answers. And at the same time, also kind of reflecting on the fact that children themselves are not a homogenous group, and that participation has always got to be understood to be something that is going to work in different ways for different people, and children alike. Like, not one method or one kind of forum or tool is going to work for everybody, and realizing that participation, it has to be creative and dynamic, and it has to be something that allows for multiple different forms of expression, yeah, it makes the most of the fact that everyone can contribute in unique ways. So I think that's something else that can help to make it feel really meaningful, is when everyone feels like they have had the opportunity to express themselves in a way that works for them. My final point, and I think this is one that's often overlooked at times, which poses a real risk, is about the feedback loop, and making sure that at the end of the day, the outcome is whether or not it produces grand change or whether there's minimal change. I think children need to be part of the feedback, and like our responsibility as adults is to ensure that children know the outcome of their participation. And of course, like, there's I guess there's a bit about ensuring that feedback is really kind of prompt, and it's because children are growing up fast, and so I know sometimes these cycles of decision making or research can take a long time, but that time is it's a very different concept when we're thinking about children who are growing up very quickly. And so making sure that feedback is constant and it's really accessible to them as well is really important. And that also helps with mitigating against things like consultation fatigue or just a general disenchantment with being involved with future participation opportunities, because they'll feel that their contribution has been valid and a worthwhile experience for them.
That's great. That's really great, Katie. I mean, I think you raised so many important points. And one of the points it makes me think about is, Christine mentioned tokenistic forms of participation. And we know that, far too often there's instances where young people are asked to, check a box on a survey and now you've participated, right? And so I think, you talk about that relational aspect, which is really, really key to understanding kind of dialogically how we can engage with young people. And you outlined a whole kind of range of different components that could potentially make participation authentic. And it makes me think about even Jarrison Lansdowne's framework on quality participation. So things like, is it inclusive? Is it child friendly? Are we being accountable to young people, which was really kind of your last point there. And I think, this kind of leads to the next question. And essentially, when we think about accountability and implementation, we know that in certain countries, there's a real kind of struggle and difficulty with actually implementing child participation, whether it be in, child service delivery systems and policies and legislation or in practice. So I know, just maybe thinking about some of those qualities that you mentioned, do you have any suggestions on, how can we ensure that implementation is effective? And, feel free to touch on different contexts, whether you want to talk about child service delivery or, research or policy or practice, but really any kind of suggestions for people who might be going into these different fields. What can we do to kind of, better in the implementation of child participation?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question for us here in Scotland right now. And I hope that some of the kind of things that we're working through here might be of interest and of help in other contexts across the world, particularly to the students that you're working with. Here in Scotland, just to give a bit of background, so we are currently at a point in time where in 2021 we will, all being well, be welcoming the incorporation of the United Nations Convention into Scots law, so into our domestic legislation. And that's as far as possible. There are certain powers that are reserved to the UK government. That means that there'll be elements of the convention that cannot be directly and fully incorporated into our domestic legislation here in Scotland due to devolution. But it's an incredibly exciting moment for us here in Scotland, as this has been something that children and adults have been campaigning for a very long time, decades in fact. And it's a real opportunity to kind of fully begin to realise children's rights in the fabric of Scottish society. Of course, bringing in legislation has to be accompanied by a culture shift. And I do think that when we're thinking about effective implementation of children's participation, and of course children's participation rights are part and parcel of realising children's human rights as a whole, it's really important to be thinking about how to implement children's participation rights from a kind of cultural perspective, as well as a kind of legislative and say policy and practice-based perspective. And so I think I might just touch on a few different elements if that's okay. And I guess at one part of it, children's participation, it's about making people realize what contribution that brings to society as a whole. There's a lot of, I think, misconceptions and fears around children's rights and realizing children's rights. And I'm speaking here from the kind of cultural context, that here it stems to cultural attitudes and long ingrained attitudes towards children at the heart of it, and who children are and what they are and what role they play within society. And it is interesting to see how culturally children are viewed. And I think this comes to how we then seek to listen to children and to take them seriously. There are still a lot of ingrained assumptions and ideas of children as particularly vulnerable, lacking in rationality or informed opinions, children being kind of seen as cute or demonized even to an extent as being sort of problematic or troublemakers. There's a whole host of different descriptions of children that really kind of diminishes their place within society and their contribution. And these kind of ideas of children not being kind of fully formed humans, if you like, and not able to share their opinion really affects how children's participation really can work. And actually there is this kind of need to help people realize that actually children are both competent and capable actors, and that they have agency and are able to express their views and are the experts in their own lives. They are the ones experiencing their lives, so we do need to be seeking their ideas and their opinions on matters that are affecting them. And so, yeah, there is the kind of cultural and societal barriers towards implementing children's participation in across services. Of course, there's an element, there's still different avenues and facets of research that there's still barriers to involving children in a meaningful way there as well, just due to the kind of concerns around how to involve children in research, both from a kind of ethics perspective, but also from, again, these ideas of what children can really contribute or bring to these processes. I think, again, it's really interesting to think about what children, what role children's participation can play in terms of enhancing service delivery and making sure that that children's participation is seen as something that's actually about the realization of all of their rights. And so in order for children's best interests to be considered, for example, and their needs to be understood by those who are delivering a service, whether that be educators or social workers or people within public services such as the police or the healthcare systems, that by listening to children and listening to their needs, but also listening to what they need from adults to respond to their needs, that actually service delivery that will in essence improve, because children have been directly engaged within these kind of ideas and conversations. It's very easy for I guess someone sitting in a position of power in, for example, like government or in a public authority to be sitting away and writing policies or guidance or coming up with this new framework or this new strategy about how we're going to work with children this way or that way. But if children themselves haven't been consulted or asked or brought into that process, how are we to know that what a child's experience is like today is how that's going to be very different to perhaps that person that was sat in their position 30 or 40 years ago. So it's really important that we're asking those who these decisions are going to affect what it's like for them. And it just creates a more, a better, fairer, more inclusive society as a whole.
That's perfect. So a lot of what you talked about is really interesting, and issues that we talk a lot to our students about as well, because you mentioned that we need to have a culture shift, which certainly in Canada, we don't really have a lot of emphasis placed on the rights of children. In many school contexts, children are actually not learning about their rights. So my assumption is that is different in Scotland, and kids do have opportunities to learn about the UNCRC and their rights.
It's very variable, and I'm going to share insights from conversations that I've been having quite often recently, but over the years as well, but more recently, given that we have this forthcoming legislation, and we've been asking children about what needs to happen in order to make sure that children's rights are made real in Scotland when this legislation comes into effect. And children time and time again tell us through Children's Parliament that children and adults need to know about their rights. And this is in fact one of their rights, as Article 42 of the Convention. But they highlight some of the main barriers. And your point about children learning about their rights in school, it's piecemeal. Children refer to the fact that it might be something that they learn. Here we would say primary 1 or 2, your kind of elementary, first few years of primary school. It might be something you learn one day, and it's put a poster and it's put up on the wall, all the articles, and it's never mentioned again. And children are saying that actually, no, children's rights need to be something that is routinely taught and understood, but also in a way that it brings it to life, and so that it's not just a list of articles that's put in the corner of the classroom and never looked at again. That actually it's something that children understand how that's directly impacting their life. And again, that process of thinking, well, when my rights are being respected, how does that look and feel? How do I feel when that's happening? And when my rights are not being respected, what's going on there? And I guess creating participatory spaces for children to be reflecting on these kind of questions alongside the adults who are responsible for upholding children's rights, and changing their behaviors and their actions to make sure that children's rights are being made real. That's kind of when, that idea of implementation can really happen, because there's that dialogue there about what needs to change.
Okay, perfect. So my next question is actually really connected to what I was just saying. So what frameworks do you use to conceptualize and implement children's rights and their participation rights?
Yeah, so at the heart of it, I mean, within my own personal practice, but also as part of an organization that takes or is underpinned by the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, we strive to take a child rights-based approach. And that is one that is, at the heart of it, uses the convention as the kind of standards upon which we work. So that's looking at how do we keep children happy, healthy, safe, and giving them the opportunity to have a say in kind of all areas of how we work. And it's, I think what the UNCRC does, it's a really useful and accessible and powerful tool for us to all have a kind of minimum set of standards for which we do not fall, but we strive to go beyond. And so a rights-based approach can be everything from, how we set out to explore issues where children's rights may be infringed or may be disrespected here in Scotland, but this could be used anywhere. And so by working with children to kind of explore what children's rights are and where their rights are being met and or not met here in Scotland is one of the ways that we set out to kind of frame the work that we do. But it also can be a really helpful framework for kind of guiding process, and also just how we work in terms of like an ethical way, but also how we design methods to work with children that allow or kind of can allow children to express themselves in the ways that work for them. And that's going to be kind of age dependent, but also dependent on the kind of different ways that children kind of can articulate or express their views and ideas. And so there's kind of a useful way of thinking about a rights-based approach in one of that kind of process. And this is also really applicable to research as well. If you are designing research, how can you ensure that that your research or your process is upholding children's rights at each step of the way? And I guess the final part is around using the children's rights framework or a child rights-based approach to highlight where we need to be holding duty bearers to account. So that outcome, if you like. So how do we work or support children or advocate with children to essentially hold duty bearers to account where their rights aren't being met, and using that as a kind of guiding set of principles to ensure that we're all doing the work to make that change. So yeah, that's definitely one of the frameworks that really guides my work. I do think it intersects with many other elements. I think one of the really kind of driving frameworks that I've kind of continue to uphold or strive to uphold and learn from is a kind of trauma informed practice as well. So looking at how we can ensure that the work that we do is accounting for the fact that we might never know the kind of trauma that other people have experienced, and that we all have to kind of come from a place of almost making assumption that everyone may have experienced some degree of trauma at some point in their life, and that we have to design the way that we work and carry ourselves in the way that we work in a way that's mindful of that. And so that's also about self-care as well. And you know, if you're working, making sure that you're able to show up and work with people who are sharing, you know, their experiences with you, and you're able to support them whilst also reflecting on your own positionality as well. But making sure that participatory spaces are safe ones, and they're ones where people feel that they can express themselves and share their views, but equally, like with any right to participation, that if people don't feel that they want to share something, that they are supported to get the help if they need that particular help in another context. So yeah, I wanted to just say a little bit about trauma informed. And I guess one framework that I kind of touched upon earlier, and it's one that there's obviously loads of phenomenal models of children's participation that have come through in research. I know you mentioned Lansdowne there earlier, and of course there's some amazing scholars that have helped to kind of produce even like really succinct like visuals, and I'd be happy to share some of these with you as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
But one that's kind of come up in the past few years that I've been thinking a lot about, and I think is a really helpful one, and definitely something I reflect on a lot, is Laura Lundy's 4Fs model. And this comes back to this idea of feedback. And I do think that often there's such a kind of, yeah, I don't know, excitement and energy behind doing the participation, if you like, you know, that process, that the end part kind of gets a bit forgotten about. So that feedback to children. And so in this model, Lundy or Laura, she uses the 4Fs, and I think it's a really helpful way of thinking about how we hold decision makers to account, or the people that are engaged in these processes, and how we communicate the importance of feeding back to children. And so the 4Fs, and I wrote them down because I wanted to make sure I got them right. But the 4Fs, so the first one is full, so making sure that the feedback that's given to children is detailed. There's an explanation there, and that's even if, for example, children have called for something, and what they have called for can't necessarily be done in the exact way, or if there's maybe something has to be slightly different, but it just shows that the person that is listening to the children has taken into account their ideas. And regardless of what the outcome is, of course we would hope that the outcome is one that's reflective of the children's experience, but the nature of it is, as long as that feedback is given in full to children about why their decisions have come out of the conversation, then that's really important. And that has to be in child friendly, so that's the second F, child friendly language, and that is really important. And I think involving children and working with children to really get an understanding of what child friendly language is as well is really important, because that's obviously going to vary by age, but also the format that comes in as well. Sometimes, yeah, that it might not just be a letter or a report. It could be a video. It could be something really creative. It could be a phone call. You know, there's lots of different ways to feed that back in a child-friendly way. Sometimes it's about asking the question about, well, what format will be best for that child. I mentioned this earlier, but making sure that it's fast. By the time some of these cycles of participation or research or decision-making processes can kind of come to an end, children might be in a different school, they might have moved on to a different youth group. Children grow up fast, and so our feedback has to follow suit. And even if that means providing feedback at different points, if a decision hasn't been reached, about just keeping children in the loop. And that leads to that final part about follow-up and just making sure that they feel that their contribution has been really worthwhile. So I find that to be a really helpful framework. It helps from a kind of transparency and accountability point of view, and it's definitely one that I think we need to be putting more emphasis into when children's participation is sought, because it's important that that children understand that their contribution is really valid and really important.
Yeah, definitely. And I think what we start to hear is about the complexity of child participation from your insights, right? And I think your point about, we can't really just homogenize childhood, and we have to really look at things like contextual features and how it shifts and changes in different contexts. And, we also know that child participation is going to look different, perhaps in research versus in policy and in different child service delivery systems. So I think you raised some really, really critical, important points. And I know you've kind of talked about this already a little bit, and you've touched on some of the barriers maybe that we face when we try to implement child participation. And, we also know that there's kind of resistance from certain groups or certain individuals about, taking a rights-based approach to working with young people. So I guess, just to end, I wanted to ask you, what kind of barriers do you see in regards to child's participation and in terms of implementation? And is there something that we can do as we try to move forward to maybe remedy some of these barriers?
Yeah, I think there's a wealth of research that has been done around the kind of chronic barriers to children's participation, which I can definitely touch on. But I also think that we've learned a lot this year alone around some of the barriers that we're seeing with children's participation as a result of being in this global pandemic. And I think I'll come and touch a little bit on that as it's linked to some of my interest and experience around digital children's participation. But first off, I mentioned earlier, like when we all kind of shared our experiences of the kind of cultural attitudes towards children's participation. And that continues, children, and how that continues to be a real barrier for children's participation. The way that we view children in society is key to being able to allow, or not allow, but create the right conditions for children to meaningfully have a say and to be taken seriously. And so I do think that that kind of recognition of how addressing these cultural barriers and kind of behavioral attitudes towards children is really key as a kind of remedy to how we make children's participation a much more kind of commonplace part of society. I think on that point, also a recognition that actually younger children are just as able to participate as older children and young people. I think there's still a slight more weighting to young people's voices being heard due to the fact that they are kind of developing their own kind of agency and out with perhaps a parental context or a familial context, and they're developing new networks and kind of skills as they progress through their education. With that comes an assumption that they're therefore more informed or more, they're closer to that point of being a fully formed adult, which we all know we become at the age of 18 with all the knowledge in the world overnight on our 18th birthday. Of course not. We're all still learning, even us as adults, believe it or not. There's lots to be learned, and actually that means that the youngest members of our society, babies right through to adolescence, are just, if the right conditions are created and the right support is in place, the right methods being used, younger children are also in a position where they are both competent and capable to share their views in a participatory way. So I think there's also that kind of misconception that younger children aren't able to be involved or shouldn't have their views sought because there's still that attitude that they're not able to. So I think there's a little bit about that continuing to be a barrier for children's participation. I think, so that's kind of some of the kind of more, I guess, like kind of cultural and behavioral attitudes. But I do think there's also some quite pragmatic and like logistical barriers to children's participation as well that we're continuing to see a bit about. Is there's kind of there's the time that's needed in order for participation to be a really meaningful and authentic experience for everyone involved is a real challenge that I think we all come up against when doing children's participation. And often this is linked to funding and funding cycles and service delivery cycles. And I think in order for those relationships to be built, and I know we were talking about the relational element of children's participation, which is so key, that ample time really needs to be built into these processes for those relationships to form, so that children feel that they can trust the adults involved, they can trust other children that they'll be potentially with during these processes. And sometimes I feel like there isn't enough time built or understood from the part of, say, those who are seeking children's views on a particular thing. That realization just isn't there. And I think we need to be more confident at communicating from the onset when we're developing a proposal or a program or some kind of agreement that this is a process that will be undertaken, that there needs to be sufficient time built in to develop those relationships. Time's also an interesting one in the fact that obviously a lot of children and young people's lives are taken up by all the really cool things that they do, and also they go to school, which also I guess can be a really cool thing, but you know, they are busy and we've got to be really respectful of the fact that like they're not going to necessarily be able to or want to drop everything to be involved in a participatory process. And so we've got to be really respectful of children and young people's time as well. And that means making sure that that we're responding as a kind of facilitator, responding to their needs and their schedules, as well as making sure that it kind of fits the outcome or the goals, if you like, of a particular participatory project. And I think some of the other barriers about the exclusionary element and making sure that children from all different backgrounds are able to have the support that they need to participate. And often, you know, there's lots of research around the risk of like over consultation, but also like the seldom heard, not having the opportunity or not being brought into these processes due to barriers like perhaps cultural barriers or financial barriers, even geographical barriers. Like here in Scotland, we're a tiny wee country, but you know, it can be really challenging. Or it has been in the past, although I'll come to how we've maybe navigated some new ways with digital technology, but it has been really challenging to reach like children who are in geographically harder to reach parts of Scotland, for example, on remote islands, where, you know, it can take days worth of travel for them to attend a workshop or a meeting. So there can be logistical barriers instead of that. And I think it's about finding ways to get creative and to find other ways of bringing children and young people together, and not using some of these kind of constraints as a way to further marginalize already seldom heard children and young people. And I do think that nicely brings me on to some of the things that we've been learning this year, or things that have perhaps helped us kind of think differently about children's participation. And I know there's a real big emphasis right now on what we're learning from COVID around digital participation and just generally how we can communicate with them. Oh, that's the children in my neighbouring block having a fun time in the hallway. But yeah, there is a lot around of conversation even prior to COVID around children's digital rights and children's digital participation. And I think it's been really interesting this year to reflect on that, because well, ultimately when the Convention on the Rights of the Child was written just over 30 years ago, we did not imagine the kind of digital world that we're living in right now. And so we're kind of having to reimagine children's rights in this digital era. And I guess when it comes to children's participation in digital rights, it's quite interesting because often there's still, you know, there's still, I guess, the provisionary and kind of perhaps protective element of the Children's Rights Convention means that sometimes the participation angle within the context of digital worlds is perhaps kind of minimized to the extent that there's still a fear of, you know, how we can navigate the digital world with regard to children's safety. And this has the potential to kind of like downplay the opportunities that we can see from the digital world for digital technology for children's play and learning and participation. So I think it's now that we've kind of all been thrown into a largely digital world over the past 8 months, it is interesting to see what progress has been made around how we can think about children's digital participation. Here at Children's Parliament, overnight, back in March, we switched our methods of usually working in schools or community groups with children to online work. And I mean, we work predominantly with younger children, kind of up to 14 years of age, but usually around kind of 8, 9, 10, 11 years old. And we were all working from home. The children were all in their homes as well. And yeah, we had to get really creative with how to use our screens to bring us all together. And I think what it's shown is that actually some of these barriers I mentioned earlier about how do we involve children that are perhaps more geographically remote, how do we bring children from different parts of Scotland to talk together at the same time, rather than us always traveling to them, has been really interesting, and it's really enhanced elements of the kind of the work that we do on different topics. At the same time, of course, this pandemic has revealed the inequalities in terms of digital access and digital literacy skills as well, and that's on the part of children, adults too. We are all completely differently equipped in our home setups, but also even in our school and office setups. And I think there's a lot to be learned from what we need to be doing to ensure that children, if we are going to be moving to looking at children's participation in like a digital way long term, and hopefully a hybrid of both in person, because I do think that it is really difficult to replace that kind of relational access or that relationship through a screen than what you can achieve in real life. But yeah, there's still, I think, a lot to be learned about, well, how do we make sure that digital participation isn't creating new barriers through the access issues that we're still facing. So yeah, I think that's probably, hopefully, some of the barriers that I can outline. There's definitely plenty more, but I like to think that we're all learning together and really trying to create good, positive solutions out of some of the challenges that we all face.
Definitely. And I think, you know, one of the points that you raised that I think is just so important to kind of reiterate is this idea of, you know, when we talk about protection and participation, we know through the convention that there should really be this kind of equal balance, but we always see oftentimes how protection rights almost trump participation rights in certain spaces. And, you know, I think you've talked about the digital world and how we can start to reconceptualize ideas about risk and harm so that there are spaces for really kind of interesting and important participatory initiatives and opportunities. And, you know, even in the context of research too, I think a lot about research ethics boards and how difficult it is for some researchers who do research with young people to get access to work in a meaningful way with young people. And so, you know, your insights kind of just made me think about that and think about the issues that we face as researchers too, when we try to include young people, and how oftentimes as a result of, you know, notions about risk and harm, oftentimes limit our ability to actually work with young people in research contexts as well. So, you know, I think you brought in so many really interesting examples, and I think we see that happening not only in research, but, you know, in digital worlds and in other spaces too. So thanks for drawing attention to that point, because I do think it is really, really important for us to think really critically about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think, I mean, as we come to the end of this year and think about, you know, where things are going, and we're here in Scotland, we're continuing to be in a sort of hybrid lockdown model where we're in tiers and there's different rules for different parts of Scotland at the moment, and that's changing kind of every few weeks. We have to be adaptable, and I think flexibility and adaptability, creativity are really central principles of children's participation, both in the sense of making sure that it works for children, but also that the kind of that we're able to be led by children, and respond to the situation that we all face, in any context. So yeah, I think there's lots to be learned and taken from this year that might actually enhance how we practice as people in this field, doing children's participation going forward.
Okay, Katie, thank you so much for sharing all of your experience and your insights with us.